Chapter 6. Fighting no one has been able to capture the real feeling of what combat is like. Many books have been written, hundreds of feet of film have been made, thousands of words have been spoken. All of these means have failed to give the true horrible picture, the awful noise, the smell, and the fear that makes one stand up and scream out the horror that is pent up inside of you. And yet, under all this, there is really something beautiful about combat. From the diary of an American soldier in the Pacific during the Second World War, war is a mystery both to those who fight and those of us who are on the sidelines, and it is a troubling and unsettling mystery. It should be abhorrent, but it is so often alluring and its values seductive. It promises glory and offers suffering and death. We who are non-combatants may fear the warriors, but we also admire, even love them. And we cannot pretend that we are not part of the same family with the same potential for fighting. Perhaps the Australian writer Frederick Manning, who wrote one of the greatest novels about the First World War, The Middle Parts of Fortune, was right when he said, "War is waged by men, not by beasts or by gods." It is a peculiarly human activity. To call it a crime against mankind is to miss at least half its significance. It is also the punishment of a crime. From the time of the earliest cave paintings, we have been trying to portray war and to grasp its complex essence in the arts, in diaries, letters, memoirs, poems, histories, novels, and movies. Yet how much can we rely on these? Memories are fallible, and the more complex and intense the events, the more difficult it is to recollect what actually happened. Moreover, each generation has its own strong conventions about how war should be portrayed, and each fixes on some things more than others. It depends, too, on who is doing the telling. A general or an admiral may see the battle as a whole, the ordinary soldier or seaman only his part, and being in the air or on or under the sea is very different from being on the ground. Also, for much of history, the records were made and kept by that minority who could read and write. We know what the knight on horseback or the captain on his poop deck thought or felt, but not the humble foot soldier or seaman. The First World War was groundbreaking, as in much else, in having a majority of combatants who could read and write. As a result, much of what we know about the experience of fighting comes from those 4 years of conflict. Even so, most of the published writers in that war came from the educated middle and upper classes. Recovering the voices of the lower classes has been difficult, although it can and has been done indirectly by, for example, looking at what officers reported from the letter of their men that they were censoring. We have to be careful, too, not to let a few accounts stand in for all the great variety of experiences in war. After the First World War, the Western Front, with its images of mud, lice, rats, death, futile attacks, callous and incompetent generals, came to dominate memories, especially in Western Europe. Of all the hundreds of novels, memoirs, and poems published by those who fought, only a handful, such as the memoirs of Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon, or Wilfred Owen's and Sassoon's poetry in Britain, Henri Barbusse in France, or Erich Maria Remarque in Germany, whose All Quiet on the Western Front became an international bestseller, have come to shape a particular and powerful view of the war. Many soldiers in the First World War, however, and this is true of many other wars as well, did not see combat at all, or were on quiet fronts where there was little action. There were many different types of battlefields during the war on the long Eastern Front, in the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, or on the seas, and many different experiences of the war, and many styles for describing them. So whatever I say here is only a sampling of what exists and what can be said about the experience of war. My examples come mainly from land fighting. Naval and aerial war are as intense for those involved, but we, the bystanders, find it harder to put ourselves in the shoes of aviators and sailors. We cannot tour the battlefields of the skies, and unless we are divers, we cannot visit the sites of great naval battles or the graves of those who died at sea. It is true that the crews of galleys and even early sailing ships once grappled with each other, but with the advent of better steering and then steam, naval war came to be about vessels trying to sink each other. By the 20th century, the seamen often never saw the enemy ships because they were over the horizon. The flying aces in the First World War often saw each other's faces as they fought, and even knew each other by name. They were seen by the troops struggling in the mass war below, and often saw themselves as modern equivalents of knights in armor, giving war a human dimension. Air war has moved on so rapidly, however, that pilots are becoming obsolete, and future aerial combat will be between machines. For the most part, the heroes we have and the stories we know are largely from land war. The Smithsonian's 2018 bestseller, Battles That Changed History, lists 42 battles between the start of the 17th century and Pearl Harbor in 1941, and only 5 of them are naval. Do we have any hope of understanding or feeling what it is to be in combat with and against other human beings? The smells, sounds, and sensations of the fighting, the presence of fear and of death, the madness that can grip the soldiers in attack, the panic of the defeated, even while the goal is elusive. We keep trying because war is so much part of being human and of our history and development. And perhaps in the cacophony of voices from so many times and so many places, we can pick out certain things that characterize fighting, the ever-present possibility of death to start with, although warriors from different cultures face it in different ways. The ancient Greeks knew the horrors of battle, but their writers described them dispassionately, with a cool appraisal of the wounds given and received, and with scant grieving over the waste of lives. Death was something that happened to warriors in the Iliad. Spears and arrows go into guts, or eyes, or chests, or groins, and the men die in agony, as Homer says of one, gasping out his life as he writhed along the ground like an earthworm, stretched out in death, blood pooling, soaking the earth dark red. And no heaven waits for them as a consolation. They are borne away into the dark. By contrast, in Christianity and Islam, there is the promise of eternal life as a recompense for suffering and sacrifice. On earth, muddle and confusion have also been part of war as long as it has existed. Battle is at once one of the most organized of human activities, and one with the greatest likelihood of things going wrong. No plan, said von Moltke the Elder, the father of Prussia's victories in the 19th century, survives first contact with the enemy. In War and Peace, Pierre Bezukhov wanders bewildered about the battlefield at Borodino. He has little idea of what is happening, whether the Russians or the French are winning or losing, and nor do the officers and men he encounters and, as Tolstoy points out, or the generals on either side. Generals' memoirs written after the event may tell the story of a grand strategic plan duly unfolding, but the reality is much messier. Even the great commanders, whether it was Napoleon trying to find a hill or a tower which would let him see the battlefield, or General Norman Schwarzkopf in the First Gulf War, with electronic eyes on the ground, can only peer into the confusion and try to gauge where the battle is going. In the midst of battle, orders can come too late, are impossible to carry out, or never get there, and the recipients misunderstand or disobey the catastrophe of the charge of the Light Brigade. When the British light cavalry charged into the mouths of the Russian guns was the result of an unclear order, and the rash command of the Earl of Cardigan who wanted glory for himself. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, when the English were badly outnumbered, the French king could not hold back his knights, who charged over France's bowmen and each other. As a chronicler reported, those behind would not stop until they had caught up with the front ranks, and when the leaders saw the other coming, they went on also. So pride and vanity took charge of events. Each wanted to outshine his companions. For soldiers, from the early modern age until the second half of the 19th century, war was literally in a fog and was also, and remains so in a figurative sense. Julian Grenfell wrote to his mother when he first arrived in France in 1914, before the war had settled down into trenches, that his force was doing marches and countermarches while the guns boomed in the distance, and no one seemed to know what was happening. As the American Tim O'Brien wrote about Vietnam in his great novel, The Things They Carried, for the common soldier, at least, war has the feel, the spiritual texture of a great ghostly fog, thick and permanent. Michael Howard, who later became a great historian of war, landed as a young officer at Salerno, partway up the Italian boot south of Naples in the autumn of 1943. In his first encounter with the German enemy, he was sent out at night to take a hill. He and his small force got lost in the dark and arrived later than planned and in some disorder at their starting point after the barrage, which was meant to give them support, was already underway. As he and his men sheltered behind a stone wall, German bullets whizzed overhead. He felt, he recalled, as though he was in a B-movie playing the gallant platoon commander. All right, I thought if I was cast as David Niven, I had better behave like David Niven. So I hissed right over with me. The British stumbled down a slope in the dark, through trees and across terrace walls. Everything thereafter became so confused that it is hard to make any coherent narrative out of it, he wrote. But he remembered shouting like a madman and the flashes and bangs from German grenades and guns. The action was successful, and the Germans retreated. The next morning, the British buried the German dead, shrunken, pathetic dolls. Many combatants have also tried to describe the pressures they feel and the intensity of the experience with the mingled fear of death, the need to keep following orders, and the strange elation that can come in battle. David Thompson, a private from New York, tried to sketch out his reactions at Antietam. The truth is, he wrote, when bullets are whacking against tree trunks and solid shot are cracking skulls like eggshells, the consuming passion in the breast of the average man is to get out of the way. Yet he got up and went forward when the order came in a second. The air was full of the hiss of bullets and the hurtle of grape shot. The mental strain was so great that I saw at that moment the singular effect mentioned, I think, in the life of Goethe. On a similar occasion, the whole landscape for an instant turned slightly red. Manning, whose novel is based on his own experiences at the Somme, talked about one bright, hard point of action. The most terrible thing, of course, said one of the Soviet women fighters Svetlana Alexeyevich interviewed, is the first battle. It's because you don't know anything yet. The sky throbs, the ground throbs. Your heart seems about to burst. Your skin feels ready to split. I never thought the ground could crackle. Everything crackled, everything rumbled. Sometimes, in the midst of battle, a strange calmness can come over the participants. In his great First World War memoir, A Soldier on the Southern Front, the Italian Emilio Lusso remembered taking part in one of the many futile attacks against the Austrian lines. The Italians were walked down an open hill that was raked by Austrian machine guns, he wrote. For a minute or so, I was overcome by a sort of mental torpor, and my whole body felt heavy and slow. Maybe I'm wounded, I thought, yet I could feel I wasn't wounded. The machine gun bullets whizzing by and the constant rush of the units on our heels woke me up instantly. I regained consciousness of my situation. Not anger, not hate as in a brawl, but utter calm, absolute, a sort of infinite wariness wrapped around my now lucid mind. Then even that weariness subsided, and I was running again, fast. One thing that comes out from many of the accounts by those who fought was their fear of being wounded or killed, of course, but also of not meeting the test of war, of giving way to panic and behaving badly. Timo, Brian, who fought in Vietnam himself, men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. Even Julian Grenfell felt fear, as he admitted to his mother after his first action in France. He wanted to claim that he had enjoyed it. But it's bloody. I pretended to myself for a bit that I liked it, but it was no good. It only made one careless and unwatchful and self-absorbed. But when one acknowledged to oneself that it was bloody, one became all right again and cool. While it is difficult to predict in peaceful conditions who will be brave and who won't, training and discipline and sometimes leadership can help to carry the warriors through the most perilous of combats. At the Battle of Gettysburg, a crucial hill, Little Round Top, nearly fell to the Confederates. The day was saved for the Union by a small, outnumbered force under the command of a college professor. Against what seemed like impossible odds, the Union forces charged with bayonets, and the Confederates broke. Sometimes, as Howard recalled, playing the part of a soldier took over as much to impress others as the fighter himself. In another attack, this time in the day, he found himself sheltering in a trench with a fellow young officer. "This is like a bad American film," said Howard. "Yes," his companion replied, "but not such fun. In Vietnam, O'Brien's soldiers talked tough. They used a hard vocabulary to contain the terrible softness. Greased, they'd say. Offed, lit up, zapped while zipping. It wasn't cruelty, just stage presence. And to cope with death, soldiers have often made a joke of it, propping up enemy corpses with cigarettes in hand. For example, in the 2 World Wars, during the Falklands War between Britain and Argentina, the British destroyer Antrim was hit by Argentinian aircraft and with leaking fuel was in danger of fire. At the tensest moment, as warning buzzers and bells were sounding and the crew were scurrying about, a stoker suddenly appeared. "Stop!" he shouted. Everyone, from officers to ordinary seamen, froze. He pointed down a passageway. Zulus, thousands of them, and disappeared. The movie of the 19th century Zulu Wars in southern Africa is apparently the favorite of the British military, even though the Zulus do rather well. A young Chris Perry, a future admiral, remembered the moment for its relieving of tension. Religion, or ritual, has long been a part of battle in many different cultures. Over the centuries, warriors have used dances, rituals, and prayers to prepare for battle and have worn amulets or observed superstitions to keep them safe. The boxers, who rebelled against the Manchu dynasty and attacked foreigners at the end of the 19th century, believed that their martial exercises made them invulnerable to bullets. Ritual can also bring catharsis. At the end of battle, when Aeneas persuades his father to flee from Troy, he asks the old man to carry their most sacred things. "Father, take in your arms the sacred emblems of our country's household gods. For me, fresh from fierce battle and recent slaughter, it would be sinful to handle them until I have washed myself clean in running water." Drink and drugs can have similar effects in helping warriors prepare for battle and deal with it afterward. The British Army, like many continental ones, used to give their troops strong drafts of brandy or rumors. In Vietnam, the American soldiers took drugs to dull their fears. In his recollections of the First World War, LSSE describes how the Italians were once nearly overwhelmed by the waves of brandy fumes coming from the Austrians as they attacked. His fellow officers drank deliberately as well as much to endure the madness of war as anything else. He saw an Italian officer trying to put his pistol on his head and shoot with his helmet. "I defend myself by drinking," said one to him. "Otherwise, I'd already be in the nut house." Neither side could see each other, yet they kept trying to kill. "It's horrible. That's why we are drunk all the time on one side and the other." Today, modern armies have developed a better understanding of treating stress, but it is inescapable in battle. While some soldiers seek death, like the last Byzantine emperor who wandered in vain about his breached city walls in 1453 in the hopes that the Ottoman conquerors would kill him, most actively try to avoid it, or at least hope that it will come for others, but not for them. Death in battle so often comes suddenly and randomly. Lusu was on the high plateau between Italy and today's Slovenia, then part of Austria, Hungary. Badly equipped and led, the Italians were forced into repeated, costly attacks on Austrian lines. He remembered sitting with a friend from university, waiting for orders for a fresh attack. They shared cigarettes and a flask of brandy and chatted about Homer, wondering whether if the great Trojan warrior Hector had had brandy, he might have been able to deal with his Greek nemesis, Achilles. "I've forgotten a lot of things about the war," wrote Lusu, "but I'll never forget that moment. I was watching my friend smile. Between one mouthful of smoke and another, a single gunshot rang out from the enemy trench. He bowed his head, the cigarette still between his lips, and from a newly formed red spot on his forehead, a thin line of blood came streaming out. Slowly, he folded in on himself and fell on my feet. I lifted him up, dead. While combatants mourn the dead, they cannot afford to linger on their loss. One suffers vicariously, wrote Frederick Manning, with the inalienable sympathy of man for man. One forgets quickly, he went on, and there is relief, too, in still being alive. The mind is averted as well as the eyes. It reassures itself after that first despairing cry, "It is I." No, it is not I. I shall not be like that. The knowledge of death makes life even more precious. After coming out of a battle on the Western Front in 1917, in which his unit took losses, Ernst Junger, author of Storm of Steel, one of the classic war memoirs, said the village where the survivors were billeted resounded with the sounds of cheerful reunions. Such libations after a successfully endured engagement are among the fondest memories an old warrior may have. Even if 10 out of 12 men had fallen, the two survivors would surely meet over a glass on their first evening off and drink a silent toast to their comrades and jestingly talk over their shared experiences. In Burma, in the Second World War, George MacDonald Fraser was surprised and perhaps a bit shocked when after a battle in which one of their number had died, none of the other soldiers in the section said much about it or the dead man. They expressed no grief or anger or obvious relief, or indeed any emotion at all. They betrayed no symptoms of shock or disturbance, nor were they nervous or short-tempered. If they were quieter than usual that evening, well, they were dog-tired yet. And again he was shocked. Before they turned in, they spread out a ground sheet and placed on it all the dead man's possessions, and each took one. It was, Fraser came to understand, a way of remembering and honoring him. Of course, being in a war is not only about fear, death, or action. It is also about waiting around, boredom, and grumbling about food, lice, the rats, weather, or the senior officers. Roman soldiers wrote letters home from the frontiers full of complaints, and if they were unfortunate enough to be on Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, asking to be sent warm clothing. 2 millennia later, Japanese soldiers in China begged their families to send them socks and underpants. A fragment of papyrus found in Egypt has a Roman soldier with another perennial complaint. But you never wrote to me concerning your health, how you are doing. I'm worried about you because although you receive letters from me often, you never wrote back to me so that I may know how you. In the trenches in the First World War, soldiers could find an escape, or at least a way of dealing with reality in writing down what was happening to them. And in this war, the majority, certainly on the Western Front, were literate in the French army. Robert D. Urgelis, who had been a tinsmith in civilian life, said he was stupefied and overwhelmed at leaving civilian life for the military. I believed I was taking the unknown track of a world turned upside down, and on the very day of my departure, I had already turned into a war writer. Manufacturers advertised special pens and small notebooks for recording life at the front, and newspapers by and for soldiers provided outlets for their work. The American Stars and Stripes published 100,000 lines of poetry by American soldiers in the short period the United States was in the war. Home is distant to those who are fighting, and not just in terms of geography. War, even more than military life in peacetime, can upend normal expectations of life and concepts of time and space. Winter is a foe if you are Napoleon in 1812 or the German army in the Second World War, but a friend if you are the Russians defending your homeland. Time can drag out unbearably before a battle, but in combat, each second seems to matter. Fraser's first face-to-face fighting with the Japanese around a small temple lasted, he thinks, for about a minute. But he remembered the scenes vividly for the rest of his life and his feelings. A continuous nervous excitement was shot through with occasional flashes of rage, terror, elation, relief, and amazement. A British soldier who fought at Mons in the First World War said a battle was a wonderfully exciting thing when it was in progress. A German soldier who was on the other side experienced, as he advanced, a shout of triumph. A wild, unearthly singing surged within me, uplifting and inspiring me, filling all my senses. I had overcome fear. I had conquered my mortal bodily self. War inverts what we think of as the natural order and morality in society. It is right and indeed necessary in wartime to blow up buildings, bridges, or railways, the infrastructure that allows societies to survive and to murder and hurt others. What is grotesque or appalling in peacetime? The smell of death or unburied corpses, dirt, rats, lice, foul water, or rotten food is simply part of the fabric of war. The possessions, fashionable clothes perhaps, or sporting equipment we surround ourselves with in peacetime lose their value, while objects we never much thought about, such as wire cutters or foot powder, become enormously important. In his The Things They Carried, O'Brien provides those lists which vary from soldier to soldier, but always include the steel helmet, the compressed bandage in case they were hit, mosquito repellent, rations, and water. In the summer of 1919, the Canadian artist David Milne was sent to record the now quiet battlefields of the Western Front, where Canadians had fought. In a letter to a friend, he listed the contents of a single shell hole: tinned food, shells, hand grenades, water bottles, bandoliers, gas masks, helmets, clothing. Just a year before, what Milne called the great mass of junk had been essential equipment of soldiers. War changes and disrupts the patterns of daily life on the Western Front. In the First World War, night was safe and day was dangerous. Soldiers were exposed by the sun to the watching eyes on the other side. Day was for resting, night for work, whether bringing up supplies, repairing or building new trenches, tunneling, or making raids into no man's land. The full moon was not something to admire. It was an enemy. Fireworks in the skies were not festive, but guides for death and destruction. The meanings of landscapes changed too. Rivers and canals were no longer for transportation or for watering crops, but defenses or obstacles to attack. Mountains, forests, hills, and valleys were part of battle plans, tactical goals to be captured or held. Vimy Ridge in northern France is only some 200 feet above the plain below, but it cost the Canadians 10,000 casualties to take it from the Germans in 1917. Open fields and farms did not produce new life, but death and harvest of ordnance, and still do as the winter frosts continue to heave up unexploded shells along the Western Front, which can still claim lives. Behavior that may be unacceptable in peacetime, swearing or blaspheming, for example, becomes normal in war. So does scrounging, or what in peacetime might be called stealing. When Fraser's section was once assigned to help unload airdropped supplies, he was offended on the men's behalf that the commanding officer greeted them with deep suspicion and warned them not to take anything. The men, to his surprise, accepted it all in good part and worked energetically and uncomplainingly throughout the long, hot day. At its end, they were congratulated for their diligence and honesty by the commanding officer and given a few packages of cigarettes as a reward. When they were back in camp, the men spread out a ground sheet, and Fraser watched with astonishment and admiration as they emptied their water bottles of mounds of sugar, and from their clothes and under their hats took loose tea, cigarettes, tobacco, and tins of food. By the time they had finished, that ground sheet looked like Herod's food hall. Sexual norms alter in wartime, too. We think at once of rape, an act of dominance and destruction. But in war, sex can also be a reaffirmation of life. The knowledge that death may be near makes peacetime prohibitions and restrictions pointless by most people's standards. "We were immoral," said an American soldier of the Second World War. "But we were young and could die tomorrow." Emotional contact with another human being mattered, even if it came through paid sex. "I've noticed it before," said the owner of a brothel in New Orleans during the First World War, when the city filled with American servicemen. The way the idea of war and dying makes a man raunchy, it was not so much for the pleasure, she noted, but a kind of nervous breakdown that could only be treated with a girl and a set. To Manning's main character, Bourne is strangely moved and touched by a young French farm girl who serves him supper, partly because she makes him aware of his own mortality and loneliness. In the shuddering revulsion from death, one turns instinctively to love as an act which seems to reaffirm the completeness of being. He does not think about women when he's at the front, he notes, as a number of experts have suggested. The closer men and women are to the battlefield, the less important sex becomes, perhaps because they are focused on survival and too busy, frightened, or simply tired. There can be a curious exhilaration in breaking taboos of all sorts, and in the sheer destruction that war brings. In July 1917, Huntley Gordon, a young Scottish artillery officer on the Western Front, wrote to his mother about a visit at night to the ruined city of Ypres, which had just received yet another heavy bombardment by the Germans. He found, he said, a strange beauty in the deserted streets where a few houses still stood. One, like a giant doll's house, had its front ripped off to expose the rooms, some still with their furniture, and a picture or two hanging aslant. As he headed toward the Menin Gate, he crossed the great square with the remnants of the great Gothic masterpiece, the Cloth Hall. I've heard of the Taj Mahal by moonlight, but for me it could never be so impressive as this ruin. The stones and masonry gleamed snowy white, and the massive tower stood there, raising its jagged turrets against the dark sky like some huge iceberg. As he hurried across, he just had time to notice the crumpled body of a soldier by a lamppost. By the time of the Second World War, the long-range bomber meant that civilians increasingly found themselves part of the battlefronts, and they too experienced that thrill of destruction. A young Canadian diplomat, Charles Ritchie, came out of a cinema in the center of London after a severe bombing in October 1940. It seemed, he wrote in his diary, as though the whole of Piccadilly were on fire. Tongues of flames were licking the colonnade at the top of the London Pavilion. We drove to the Dorchester through bombs and shrapnel. There seemed to be fire everywhere. He and his companion were childishly excited and elated. There is an exhilaration in this orgy of destruction and in the danger. But the next day was the morning after the debauch. I was awakened by the sound of shoveling glass. On August 6, 1945, a Japanese lecturer, Ogura Toyofumi, was heading into Hiroshima. Suddenly, there was a massive flash. He stood transfixed by the giant swirling cloud that grew and spread. He recalled, no adequate ways to describe it. The unsophisticated concepts and fantasies dreamed up by the ancients were useless to describe this horrible pageant of clouds and lights staged in the firmament. He kept walking toward the city, drawn by an impulse to experience the destruction which he later described as the greatest of its kind man had ever experienced. Explaining what being in war is like is never easy. It is hard to find the words and images. Hard, too, when those who are at home do not want to hear about the realities of life in combat. Gordon, the young Scottish officer, complains in his memoirs of being home on leave in Edinburgh and the endless stream of visitors with their inane questions about what it is really like at the front. Fine. Thanks. Just fine is all he replies. What else could one say? How could they begin to understand we were now simply in different worlds? Modern war makes the contrast between those different worlds particularly sharp. Today, combatants can be plucked from the battlefield and whisked around the world. But even in the First World War, it was possible for soldiers on the front to be in the trenches one day and home in their own countries the next. What can also upset those who are fighting is the impression that many at home are profiting from the war. The ordinary soldiers in Manning's novel, or in Fraser's memoir, complain repeatedly about the high wages workers in mining, for example, or war industries are getting, about the profits manufacturers are making, or simply about how civilians might be enjoying themselves. Another young Scottish officer, John Reith, later to be Lord Reith, and the long-serving head of the BBC, spent part of his first leave during the First World War in London. He had dinner with his brother, but could not enjoy the rich food and the sumptuous surroundings. He noticed how many men were not in uniform. Anyhow, it all jarred. I was out of touch with this sort of life and felt resentful of it. During the Japanese invasion of China in the late 1930s, a Japanese soldier wrote, "I wonder if the people at home, overjoyed with the thought of ever-victorious Japanese soldiers, understand the unending pain that comes with this victory." Eric Maria remarks, "All Quiet on the Western Front is a novel, but it draws on Remarque's own experience as a German soldier, and the scenes when his protagonist, Paul Baumer, tries to describe what the war is really like are echoed in countless memoirs and letters from the First World War. When Baumer goes home on leave, he finds himself unable to communicate anything about the reality of the war to his acquaintances or his family. He does not want to upset his dying mother or his father, and the others want the sorts of stories about glorious deeds or the coming victory that he cannot tell. He reflects sadly that he never should have come home. Another gap that opens up between the war and home fronts is that civilians often hate the enemy more than those doing the fighting. In the Second World War, a British study showed that people who lived in rural areas not affected by the Blitz were more likely to want German cities bombed in reprisal than those who actually lived in cities that had been badly hit. A survey done of U.S. servicemen in the same war showed that those who had not yet left the United States were much more likely to agree that the Japanese should be wiped out altogether than those already in the Pacific. The combatant who admits, like Ernst Junger does, that he went into battle in the grip of a berserk rage and longing to kill is rarer than the British officer in the Second World War who said of the enemy, in fact, "We respected them as brave soldiers, but our job was to defeat them and win the war." In the Iliad, when Achilles calls one of the Trojans, he is about to kill friend. He is recognizing that they are both warriors, who are doing what they must. One cannot blame them, writes Gordon of the Germans in the First World War, for defending themselves and shelling us. He cannot hate them, he finds. Indeed, he feels a sort of pity for them, since they may be having an even worse time than the British. The Christmas truces on the Western Front, which broke out spontaneously along the lines until the military authorities put a stop to them, and the informal live and let live arrangements to let each side collect its corpses undisturbed, for example, reflect a sense that shared hardships and humanity cross lines. Frank Richards, whose Old Soldiers Never Die, is one of the rare First World War accounts by an ordinary soldier took part in such a truce in 1914. The men came out first and the officers followed. "We mucked in all day with one another," he said. The Germans sent a barrel of beer over to the British trenches, and the British sent back plum pudding in return. One of their men, speaking in English, Richards recalled, mentioned that he had worked in Brighton for some years, and that he was fed up to the neck with this damned war, and would be glad when it was all over. We told him that he wasn't the only one that was fed up with it. That fellow feeling holds true for other wars in other times and places. A Japanese soldier in China in the late 1930s is saddened when his commander orders one wounded Chinese soldiers to be interrogated and then killed. Even though there are enemies, they're human beings with a soul like all other living things in this world. To use them as helpless tests for one's sword is truly cruel. A Soviet woman who was a medical assistant in a cavalry regiment during the Second World War recalled the remorse she felt when she shot 2 German soldiers. One was such a handsome young German, it was a pity, even though he was a fascist. All the same, that feeling didn't leave me for a long time. You see, I didn't want to kill. There was such hatred in my soul. Why had they come to our land? But when you yourself kill, it's frightening. A much-cited study of American soldiers in the Second World War concluded that only 15 to 25% were prepared to aim and fire at the enemy. The rest either did not shoot at all or aimed wide. Similar studies of Germans and Japanese in the war showed much the same results. Not surprisingly, such findings, and they have been challenged since, spurred an increased interest into how the insights and tools of psychology could be incorporated into military training to turn recruits into efficient killers who would not flinch on the battlefield. Leaders sometimes, but not always, can make a difference to how men and women behave in battle. Alexander, Julius Caesar, Admiral Horatio Nelson, General George Patton, and Napoleon all seem to have had an uncanny ability to motivate their men to kill and to face death boldly. Each consciously played the part of leader, encouraging the legends that surrounded them and manipulating symbols and portents. Alexander would use artifice to add signs for victory. When the livers of animals were inspected for omens by his priests, when someone offered him a helmet full of water in a dry desert, he dramatically poured it out to show that he would rather suffer with his men. A legendary Chinese general, when given a keg of sweet wine, ordered it to be poured into a river so that he and his soldiers could all drink the mingled water and wine. Napoleon's propaganda made much of his dramatic gallop over the Alps, when in reality he sat on a slow-moving mule, and of his claim that when he rested in the monastery at the St. Bernard Pass, he found a copy of Livy and read the passage on Hannibal, who had made the journey before him. Great commanders also have that indefinable quality of charisma, with a presence that seems more than human and an ability to see into the human soul. The battle-hardened General Dominique René Vendôme said of Napoleon, "So it is that I, who fear neither God nor the devil, am ready to tremble like a child when I approach him." Napoleon's great adversary, the Duke of Wellington, once said that the emperor's presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men. After his final defeat, when Napoleon went on board the ship carrying him to his lonely exile on St. Helena, he immediately charmed the entire crew, and officers and lesser officers have had a similar impact on the battlefield. Physical courage matters, but there is more to it than that. Captain Mallet, in Manning's novel, had a huge presence. The impression he left on the mind was not one of mass, but of force and speed. It was his expression, his manner, something in the way he moved and spoke, which made one feel that only an enormous energy enabled him to bridle the insubordinate and destructive energy within him. Perhaps in battle it broke loose and gratified its indomitable appetites. His men admired his nonchalance and daring, as when he walked along the top of the trenches or went back into no man's land to get the ash stick which he had left behind. Some leaders, like General Patton or Field Marshal Montgomery, were flamboyant, playing to the audience. Others, like General Slim, whom George MacDonald Fraser encountered in Burma, impressed in a different sort of way. He was the only man he had ever seen, said Fraser, who had a force that came out of him, a strength of personality that I have puzzled over since, for there was no apparent reason for, was not his appearance. To Fraser, Slim looked more like a yard foreman who had been promoted to managing director or a farmer. Nor was it his way with words, for he sat with the men, chatting simply and unpretentiously about the campaign against the Japanese. Yet Fraser came away with the feeling that Slim understood the ordinary soldier. I think it was that sense of being close to us, as though he were chatting offhand to an understanding nephew. Not for nothing was he Uncle Bill. That was his great gift. For the most part, however, ordinary soldiers and sailors seem to have tolerated their officers where they have not actively despised them for their impossible orders, their lack of understanding of conditions on the ground, and, especially for the higher ranks, their remoteness from the reality. Emilio Lusu has left a vivid account of one of his generals in the First World War who was bent on glory, whatever it cost the troops. "Do you love war?" the general asks, his eyes spinning madly, like the wheels of a racing car. When Lu Su says that he does not particularly, the general explodes with contempt. "So you're for peace, are you?" "For peace?" Just like some meek little housewife. Although the Italians do not yet have any artillery, the general is determined to attack the Austrians, which he does with predictable results. When his mule dances close to the edge of a cliff and tries to shake him off one day, not one of the Italians moves. The soldier who eventually rushes forward to save him is later beaten by his fellows and denounced as a disgrace to his unit. Abstract ideals, powerful though they might be, and even great leaders, are not and have never been the most important forces sustaining those in battle. The Greek hoplites in their lines, the Swiss in their squares, sailors, whether on galleys or aircraft carriers, pilots and squadrons, all rely on and fight for each other. As Plutarch said, men wear their helmets and breastplates for their own needs, but they carry their shields for the men of the entire line. "You love your comrade so much," said a 14th century knight. "You are prepared to go and die or live with him." Soldiers might be rough with each other, but they could also be surprisingly gentle. Friendship seems too pallid a word, and love too romantic. although there are elements of both in what combatants have tried to express down through the centuries. The best that English can do is comradeship. Manning called it an intensity of feeling which friendship never touches. People are thrown together, often haphazardly, in war, and yet they can develop such strong attachments that they will give up their lives for each other. Siegfried Sassoon came to hate the war as a dirty trick played on his generation, but he still went back to his unit for the sake of his comrades. When Bomber from All Quiet on the Western Front rejoins his friends after his leave, he says simply, "This is where I belong." Younger remembered coming back to the front after being wounded. It was like returning to the bosom of a family when the French were besieged at Dien Bien Phu. In their ill-fated attempt to bring victory against the Vietnamese in Indochina, the fort's outposts fell one by one, and their garrisons were taken off to prison camps. Among the prisoners were Germans from the Foreign Legion who decided to look out for themselves. They told the Viet Minh camp commander that they had seen the light and no longer supported the French. As a result, their treatment and rations dramatically improved. Every morning, they would stand to for a lecture from the commander, who would talk about the Viet Minh victories. The day before, the German legionnaires would cheer and sing the Internationale, the anthem of the international communist movement. Then one day, the commander announced that hills held by legionnaires had been taken after hard fighting. The German prisoners remained silent. "Come on, sing," said the camp commander. "What are you waiting for?" The Germans looked at each other and then broke into a song which dates back to the Napoleonic Wars. "Ich hatte einen Kameraden. Einen besseren findest du nicht." I once had a comrade. You couldn't find a better one. They were stripped of all privileges. Those who have fought may want to forget the horrors of war, or try to. But many veterans also look back nostalgically to that comradeship and the ways in which life was simpler, with fewer alternatives or choices. And some missed the excitement. Probably he would never look down on the lines again, wrote a British pilot after the First World War. Never search the sky for Huns. Never fire his guns at a living target. Never hear the infernal staccato behind him. Never see tracers come up from the ground. All that was over and past. Nevermore the dawn patrol and the hard-boiled egg. Nevermore the terrific binges and the inimitable comradeship. Nevermore the frantic excitement and the ghastly fear. All that was over and life was empty. There is a memorable scene in Catherine Bigelow's film The Hurt Locker where the hero, William James, a bomb disposal expert who risks his life repeatedly in Iraq, is home at the end of a tour of duty, and his wife asks him to get some breakfast cereal in a supermarket. He stares in bewilderment at shelf after shelf of different brands. Shortly afterward, he re-enlists. Frank Richards used to meet a friend in a pub for years after the First World War to swap stories. We generally wound up our evenings with the old song set to the tune of a well-known hymn. Old soldiers never die. They simply fade away. When the strongly anti-war musical Oh, What a Lovely War opened in London in the early 1960s, many of those who had fought in the First World War were still alive. A friend of mine was there one night when several busloads of veterans were in the audience. They sang along with the old tunes and jammed the bar, reminiscing happily. Not, one assumes, a reaction. The cast and its left-wing director, Joan Littlewood, were counting on this. Enjoyment of war is something that makes civilians in peaceful societies uncomfortable. A Canadian general I was once interviewing for an educational radio program spoke about the excitement of war, but only after I had turned off my tape recorder. It was, he said, like riding a very fast motorcycle. The knowledge that you could crash and die at any moment. Added to the thrill, even more disturbing, is the realization that some combatants actually enjoy having the power of life and death over another and take pleasure in killing and destruction. The Australian Ian Llewellyn Idris who was a sniper in the First World War, said that he felt only hot pride, that in fair warfare I had taken the life of a strong man. In the Second World War, a British pilot found that he could not sleep after downing 2 German aircraft. There was nothing else I could talk about for days after. There was nothing else I could think about for weeks after. It was sweet and very intoxicating. One of the shocking things about Younger's memoir is the way he lays out his feelings without any apology or explanation. In an early edition, which he later revised to make it somewhat less brutal, he talks about shooting an Englishman. He snapped shut like the blade of a knife and lay still. In another passage, which he did leave in, he talks about how he and his fellow soldiers poured fire into a British advance. The enemy were bewildered and started hopping about this way and that like rabbits, while clouds of dust were whirled up between them. Julian Grenfell's letters to his mother are equally open and are full of references to how lucky he is to be in the war and to what fun he's. I adore war. It is like a big picnic without the objectlessness of a picnic. I have never been so well or happy. Nobody grumbles at one for being dirty. The excitement of fighting vitalizes everything, every sight and word and action. He had an odd feeling, he admits, the first time he shot a man, but very soon it gets like shooting a crocodile, only more amusing because he shoots back at you. Like Younger, he watches death as he meets it out with mild curiosity. He just gave a grunt and crumpled up, he says of one German. He hopes, he tells his mother, that the war will go on for a long time, but pig-sticking will be the only tolerable pursuit after this, or one will die of sheer ennui. He was shot in the head and died in May 1915. His brother and 2 cousins also died in those first months of the war. When the BBC's Lord Reith wrote a memoir in the 1960s about his time as a young British transport officer in the First World War, he had trouble finding a publisher because his memories did not fit well with the prevailing view that the war was loathed by everyone who was unfortunate enough to be in it. He was happy and thrilled to be in France when he rode at night through Armentières. His reaction was how queer it all was, how vastly exciting. Exciting to be on a horse at all. On a horse in the dark streets of this deserted foreign town, instead of just at this time setting out with one's mother to go to evening service in Glasgow. Although being a transport officer meant that he was billeted behind the lines in relative comfort, he faced the possibility of death every time he and his men crossed open ground with their horses and wagons. He was pleased to discover that he was not afraid, but put it down to chance more than any virtue he might possess. It was interesting, he noted, to walk across a turnip field knowing that at any moment one will stop walking for the most conclusive of all reasons. He wondered perhaps if his Christian faith was a help. I felt there were special transport facilities from the racked battlefield on which we stood to the green pastures and still waters beyond. When he was invalided out after being badly wounded in the face, he wrote to his parents, "I am more disgusted than I can say. I was getting on so well and enjoying the work and everything." He also noted in his memoir the beauties that war can produce: the daylight in the summer, the wildflowers in no man's land, the blue sky flecked with the white of anti-aircraft shells bursting. Night fighting could be even more spectacular. Lusu described an Austrian artillery attack. It looked as though all those fireworks exploding over that forest of fir trees were lighting up the columns and the naves of an immense basilica. The nearness of death can make the world lovelier and more precious. "You sit in a filthy paddy being shot at," wrote O'Brien. But for a few seconds, everything goes quiet, and you look up and see the sun and a few puffy white clouds, and the immense serenity flashes against your eyeballs. The whole world gets rearranged, and even though you're pinned down by a war, you never felt more at peace. Books and movies cannot get it, said a Russian woman veteran of the Second World War. No, not doesn't come off. I start talking myself. That's also not it. Not as frightening and not as beautiful. Do you know how beautiful a morning at war can be before combat? You look, and you know this may be your last. The earth is so beautiful, and the air, and the dear sun. Like war itself, the peace afterward affects those who fight in many different ways. Nostalgia, pride, hatred of war, post-traumatic stress, anger, sorrow. An American veteran of Vietnam said of that war, and it is impossible to tell if he was glad or not. It had burned away the boy in him and left a man of tempered steel. Zinaida Vasiliana, who had been a medical assistant in a Soviet infantry company in the Second World War, told Alexievich, "In war, your soul ages. Some veterans cannot bear to talk about their war experiences at all." A woman who had been a sergeant in the anti-aircraft artillery told Alexievich, "There was no one I could tell that I had been wounded, that I had a concussion. Try telling it. And who will give you a job then? Who will marry you?" We were silent as fish. Sometimes veterans can talk to their grandchildren, perhaps because war is so far away for these young people, and perhaps because the children will not really grasp the meaning of what they are hearing. As Alexievich says, war remains, as it always has been, one of the chief human mysteries. Perhaps the final word should go to the great Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who, as he watched the Union troops make one futile and costly charge after another at Fredericksburg in 1862, said, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it."